Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor
Um,
Stoner.
the uh, the world continues to change at an accelerating rate, and this past week I've come to think that maybe um, we're approaching 1984. Actually, I understand that the sales of 1984 have greatly increased
Yes, they
since
have.
November. I hope I'm right in remembering that it's in 1984 that the world is divided into three superpowers, and but the alliance, there's always two of them are always allied against the other, but the alliance is always changing. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's correct. That's correct.
Because I think what's happening now is we have a world that's divided into three powers, each of which is making sure that they are in control of their zone of influence. And so it started with America being angry with the Soviet Union in the early 1960s because the Soviet Union took an interest in Cuba, which was America's territory.
Hmm.
And then it was reasonably quiet from then until a couple of years ago when the Russians decided that they were going to make sure that they controlled their zone of influence, including Ukraine and Crimea, in order to make sure that NATO didn't keep expanding into their territory. And now China is making sure that it controls the South China Sea and the East China Sea, so that America, which has a special relationship with all the governments around the East China Sea and the South China Sea, can't control the part of, the actual, what should I call it, right up to China's coast. I mean, I think this is what's going on. It's the and gradually the world will, because up until 1991 the world was pretty much divided between two zones of influence.
Hmm.
That was the bipolar period,
Right.
but I think we're actually now moving into a tripolar period, and the world will be divided not just ideologically, but actually in terms of the influence of three superpowers into a Chinese region, a Russian region, and an American region. What do you think?
I think you're probably correct, or George Orwell was correct. My only question would be, what about that everyone else category?
Everyone else?
Yeah.
Well, is there
that,
anyone else?
well, I mean, that's a broad term. I mean, everyone else could be the European countries. It could be the extra-national terrorist groups. It could be India. It could be...
Well, then actually, I mean, the European countries, I think, are all on America's side rather than Russia or China. But you're right that there is a fourth collection, and that's what's generally thought of as the Islamic world. So maybe, but I think, the likelihood is that the Islamic world will be divided up between those three powers.
You think so?
And that's more or less what's going on now.
Well, I think when Orwell wrote the book, and you're right, it has become intensely popular. They're flying off the bookshelves. I've even dug out my old copy. And I think when he wrote the book, he may have, I don't know for sure, but I suspect the impetus was almost a social impetus as to what he felt big government or potential totalitarian government could do to the human being. And he might not have been as far-seeing from a geopolitical sense to look at the prospective camps. So I guess I'm wondering is whether or not the breakup into three camps, which is certainly a logical assumption, is that happening? Is it being aided and abetted by increasing globalization, or is it happening despite globalization?
Well, I think every country in the Islamic world has a primary commitment to one of those three powers.
Mm-hmm.
Those three powers really don't have any competitors.
Except themselves. Yeah.
Everybody is, except themselves, everybody is beginning to be more and more security conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the likelihood is that and it's because of globalization that they're expanding their areas as contiguous areas rather than having a country here and a country there and a country somewhere else, which is what the case was in the bipolar era. Anyway, that's the picture I see at the moment.
Well, that's a pretty dismaying picture.
Yes, so it's, given that I'm basically an optimist, I suppose it's out of character, but at least it's not. None of the three powers are controlling the individual in the way that Big Brother did in 1984. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that makes things worse for individual citizens, and it doesn't mean to say that people won't be able to travel back and forth from one of the three powers to another.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a division of the world into security areas.
Which, when you think about it, is not terribly different than the past several hundred years anyway. Whether it was the British security areas, the American security areas, the Spanish security areas, the Portuguese security areas, the Dutch security areas, you can go right down the list.
It's just that with the modern technology and modern communications abilities, the boundaries are much clearer.
Mm-hmm. So what will happen if one of the big three drops out? And I'm reminded of President Obama's categorization of Russia as a failing regional power.
Yes, well, that's certainly an interesting question. And Russia is, I would say, the weakest of the three at the moment, although possibly with the most determined leader, but not necessarily the most competent leader.
Mm-hmm.
Russia is the only one of the three that doesn't have an electoral system that everybody it seems to be comfortable with. So it's quite possible that Russia's position in that threesome could change. Presumably, Putin, despite his gym habits, can't last forever, and we've no idea who might take his place. How old is Putin anyway?
I believe he's 62.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, here's my reaction to largely what you said. The idea of globalization, I've always viewed as being part and parcel to almost empowering the individual, much more so than the individual might have been empowered in the past. So
yes, because it's come in hand with what has been called informalization. Mm-hmm. So the formality of personal relations, that means you have to take account of everybody's social position, who are more important than you are and who are less important than you are, which is the way the world was in the middle of the 20th century, has more or less disappeared now, and you can talk to anybody and you can travel anywhere. And that seems to be the way the global community will be as it continues to develop.
Well, I think some of the protests in the United States that have been going on against the Trump agenda. I saw last night a United States senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, one of 100 U.S. senators, pretty rarefied group, standing in front of a group of 2,300 angry Arkansans. And talk about informality. It was informality with an exclamation point. They were screaming at him. And the senator, to his great credit, was very collected and calm. But I think the point that you made is a good one. The barriers, the social barriers have been dropped. And in the United States now, with the current president, he is also someone who drops the social barriers. And I suppose what I'm wondering is what's going to happen when this tripartite structure begins to become buffeted by these empowered individuals who do not stand on formality of any sort.
And if you go to the web page of the Atlantic Monthly and click on the right button, you'll see about 20 pictures, photos of demonstrations over the past week.
Mm-hmm.
Some of which are anti-Trump in different parts of the world,
mm-hmm.
And the others are against the attempt to block the movement of refugees, in favor of refugees.
Right, right.
So I think that there's no doubt about the fact that in the next few decades, the amount of movement of people from one part of the world to another is going to increase. And that means that it's going to be more and more difficult for any government, whether a superpower or not, to actually control anything.
Well, you've often talked about globalization from the ground up, and I think we're seeing that in living color now in the Western democracies.
Yes. I think that the most important thing about globalization and the way that it needs, if it can be defined, the way that it has to be defined has to do with the way everyday social life is changing as everybody becomes more and more aware of larger and larger numbers of people in other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And but still, so that leaves us with a sort of irony that while governments are controlling, losing their control over people, nevertheless their armament technology is giving them greater control over territory.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. And in fact, I just before we started today, I glanced at the television and there was a headline that Trump apparently said today that the United States must modernize its nuclear weapons technology and become the biggest and the best. It's like, oh, come on. I mean, how many do you need? But it's an interesting juxtaposition of events.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next week.
Well, hopefully nothing. Hopefully nothing in that direction. So, all right, Professor Spooner. Thank you very much.
See you in March.
Bye. Yes.